making the technology behave itself. Don't adjust your screen. You will notice I don't have a West London logo in the background. I'm afraid I work for Bournemouth University on Fridays, so I'm currently down on the coast, where it is grey and drizzly, as I'm sure it is wherever you are. Grand. Thank you for putting up, Josie. I don't know if I can control it or not. If I can't
Simon, we seem to be having problems there, but what we can do is if you just tell us when to move to the next slide, we'll do it that way.
Yep, brilliant. That's exactly where I was going. Can I just check audio quality as well? Am I sufficiently audible and clear that people can follow what I'm saying?
Yep, you're perfectly clear.
Grand. Okay, right. So as I've been following along today, I've been having an increasing sense of dread as we've listened to some very impressive presentations about enormous new buildings and fancy technology and cutting edge this and that. And I'm going to bring us back down to earth with a bit of a bump and talk a bit more about people. Which I suppose is appropriate for psychologists to do. I'm going to talk a little bit about an ongoing strand of research that we've been trying to build up within the hospital, both in terms of understanding what's going on with the patients we work with diagnoses of personality disorder, and what we might be able to do differently or additionally to try to help speed people's recovery. So I'm going to focus it up on interpersonal cycles, the role of those in the maintenance, particularly of personality disorder, bearing in mind that most of the patients that we work with at Broadmoor have some diagnosis of personality disorder. And of course, the line between personality disorder and psychosis are not as clear-cut and bright as we might want them to be. Thanks, Josie. If you can move us on. So I suspect most of us have a sense of the dangers of being drawn into difficult types of dynamics with our patients. We sometimes, not always helpfully, talk about patients as being manipulative or attention-seeking, but what we're emphasizing there is that we are anxious about what we might get drawn into with patients. Often on the edge, when we use those words, we're thinking that these patterns are deliberate choices, conscious choices on the parts of our patients, which I don't think is always the case. And also from the other side, we sometimes have anxieties about the impact of mental health services and how sometimes, particularly in high secure services, we can be drawn into ways that we have to kind of engage with our patients, which might be things that might recapitulate the traumas that they've been through. And I think both of those anxieties misplace where we ought to be paying our attention. The attention there is locating the source of any potential damage, either within the patients or within the staff or within the service. And I think we'll get farther and have more ability to engage with these kinds of difficulties if we look at what's happening between people and focus specifically on the relationship dynamics. Thanks, Josie. So an example which may be familiar, this is based on a multitude of different patients that I've worked with, but I think much of this will probably resonate for people who've worked in these kinds of services. Let's call this particular person Michael, and having a history which is not unfamiliar to those of us who work in secure psychiatric care, extensive abuse, particularly sexual in this case, at home, in care, and later going on to become an offender himself. So his perception of the world is that other people see him as disgusting. They want to get rid of him. They want to take advantage of him. But he sees himself as disgusting and fully deserving of being treated that way. So he's almost in agreement with how he sees other people as seeing him. So he expects when he gets to Broadmoor, people are going to deprive him of what he needs, particularly care. So, for instance, he says, I've ordered something. And they say, oh, it may be a risk item. I'm not sure we can allow that in. And for him, that's a deliberate attack. It's a personal attack. They're showing how little they care. He becomes angry about the injustice. He may become passive aggressive, blanking people, just refusing to work with people, putting in complaints. those kinds of things. And often female staff get targeted more than male staff in this kind of passive aggressive way. Sometimes because they form a more intense felt bond from their point of view with female members of staff, so they're more capable of causing them pain, so they attack there harder. Josie, thank you. So, for example, continuing this, thinking about it now from the point of view of the staff who are being treated like that, that's an intense thing to try to absorb, absorbing that anger, absorbing those complaints. It feels personal, and it is deliberately personal. They may be scared, they may feel demeaned, and now, as human beings, they need to protect themselves from that. They may remain perfectly professional, but they may become a bit more emotionally detached, slightly colder, and towards an extreme, perhaps saying, I can't work with that patient, it's, they have a complaint against me, I need to make sure I maintain my distance. Or even as very professional people, we can lose our temper with the patients. And we've all seen this happen from time to time. But when those kinds of things happen, even from the subtle to the less subtle, to Michael's eyes, that proves he was right. People do hate him, people do want to get rid of him, just like everybody else. And we've closed the loop for this particular patient. So that's kind of our experience as mental health professionals. It's a very difficult thing to try to capture in an empirical way with research. But this is a description of some slightly rough and ready ways we've been trying to do that. Thank you, Josie. So don't be scared by this slide, but I'm going to just give you a couple of threads of research which indicate to me the impact of these interpersonal cycles in personality disorder and how you might see them act themselves out. So this is a long-term study where they've measured 3 things: borderline personality disorder symptoms, the little circles at the bottom, and 2 types of life events, what they call independent, acts of God, things we have no control over, getting into a car crash, presuming you didn't do it because you were drunk. Those are the boxes along the top. And dependent life events, where we may have been caught up in those, that there was an influence we had on them, getting a divorce, for instance. And those are the boxes along the middle. And they've measured these at 3 points, and they're seeing how they relate to each other. And what they expected to find was that the life events at one time point would lead to drive borderline personality disorder symptoms later on. And actually, they found the other way around. This is not an uncommon pattern called stress generation. The level of borderline personality disorder symptoms at one time point, if you follow, say, the line from that circle in the lower left-hand corner up diagonally, the figure there you'll see is larger than some of the other figures. Those symptoms are driving dependent in life events. So the fact of having those symptoms is meaning that you're more likely to have these kinds of life events in the future. And those life events are then help to maintain the symptoms of personality disorder over time. So one of the things that is maintaining or driving personality disorder symptoms in this community sample is this change from having the symptoms to having these dependent interpersonal life events to maintenance of symptoms to more interpersonal life events, and round in a cycle. Thank you, Josie. Another thing that caught my eye years ago, and there's been follow-ups from this more recently than this, is looking at what we call economic games. So we're looking at here putting people into a little game where one of them is an investor. They get given some money, say $20, and they can choose to give a certain amount of it to a trustee, anything from $0 to $20. So that person can then amplify that money, and they get engaged in some activity, and it's multiplied by 3, and they can decide how much money to give back to the investor. And you could have little breakdowns of trust where the investor goes, well, actually, I'm going to keep this money because I don't think you're going to give me very much. I'll hang on to 15 of it and give you 5. And the trustee can try to coax them back in by doing things like giving them the majority of the money coming back from the investment activity. So you get this maintenance of trust, which breaks down if one of the people involved in this has a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, because they were not able to try to rebuild that trust. So if the investor lost trust in them, started giving them less money, they didn't try to coax them back by giving them a big payout. They just withdrew and stopped giving the person any money back. And the amount of money going around in this game less and less and less. So again, you can see this cycle, but in quite a short time period, over a period of several rounds of a game that you might just do, over a half hour. But again, you've got people coming in maybe with an expectation that people aren't to be trusted, and by the end of this game, they're proving themselves right. Thank you, Josie. Don't get too worried about this slide as well. This is a way I try to think about personalities. So what I'm going to talk you through it, and then this links to the studies that we've been trying to do. So this is kind of a mirror image. If you draw a line from the top left to the bottom right, this is two people interacting with each other, and it's the same on both sides of that divide. So starting off on the left-hand side, we've got service users with traumatic experiences and difficult temperaments. You combine those two, you get people who have attachment disorders, intense schemas, types of things that bias how they look at, attend to, and remember their interactions with other people. Those interactions in this case being with staff members, and they might interpret them in a very biased way. This person's being hostile towards me. They then have limited skills to be able to manage that. They react in quite intense ways. All of those things are also driven by cultural narratives. So the way they react to women is going to be different from the way they react to men. There's gender differences in the way men and women react to distress, and so on. So they've reacted in this intense way. On the other side of the divide, you've got a staff member who has their own, less intense schemas and attachment, and less intense biases in how they see other people, perhaps. But they're getting this very intense behavior being directed at them, which you're going to interpret, possibly correctly, as being a personal attack, attempt to demean me, put me down. So I might feel more intense if they've got particular types of schemas. They hopefully have more effective ways of managing those emotions, but it's still going to leak out in their reactions. But those reactions then feed back into the patient's side. They'll see those reactions through the lens that they started off with, and they'll be able to go, yes, that reinforces what I expected in the first place. This person doesn't like me because people don't like me. Thank you, Jonathan. Keep an eye on the chat. Thank you, Josie. Oh, no, that's right. Unfortunately, I'm saying thank you with two people with the same starting initial. So we've done some projects. These are what I'm going to show you. The next few slides are based on doctoral clinical psychology trainees who are doing their theses, working in Broadmoor and other services. So this is some qualitative research looking at their experiences on the ward, particularly focusing on relatedness with staff members and progress through the hospital. So you can see some of the themes that come out here are about feeling controlled, feeling dependent, feeling resentful of control, but at the same time needing connection with staff members. And some of the comments that came out of there were kind of indicative of the kinds of things I'm talking about, that people would, they'd sit there being upset and people would stay back from them. As someone who believed that people didn't care, picking up to their mind evidence that people do not in fact care. Or the bottom comment there about someone who seems to think that other people see them as being stupid, and they interpret staff in that way. Other people see me as stupid. Their interaction with the staff are feeding into this perception they have of themselves and the perception they have of other people. Thank you, Josie. We've tried to do some studies using questionnaires, using what's called kind of mediation analysis, trying to look at the way that these different parts of that model I was showing you before might play out for patients within Broadmoor in this particular case. This is an example of one that did not work. Despite our best efforts. They're measuring interpersonal sensitivity. So this is people's reactivity to a particular interpersonal style on others' part. So interpersonal sensitivity to feeling dominated, how they're related to their perceived coercion on a ward and their reactions of anger. So although there were relationships within this, what we were expecting to try to see is what we call a mediated relationship. So that the relationship from between interpersonal sensitivity to dominance and anger is carried by the perceived coercion, perception of coercive relationships on the ward. Lots of reasons why this one didn't quite work out, but it gives you a sense of the types of things we're trying to do just with questionnaire-based studies to try and look at statistically the relationships between different types of biases that the patients might hold, and how that affects their interpretation of staff and then their reactions towards staff. This is one example of that. It didn't quite work out. Josie, if we move on to the next one. This one did work out, and I think it's possibly because it's looking at a slightly more firmly based concept or construct of attachment style in this case, which has good relationships with how we perceive other people, has been looked at over many years. So another mediation analysis. In this case, we're looking at the two aspects of attachment style, avoidance and anxiety. I've got a bit of distortion on my screen. I hope that's just my screen. How that relates to their sense of connection with the staff on the ward, and how that in turn affects their readiness to engage in treatment using validated measures of these kinds of things. And we did find, particularly for avoidance, that the relationship between that and the readiness to engage in treatment, which is a relationship that the research said already was there, people lower, higher in attachment avoidance, less readiness to engage in therapy, that was at least partly mediated by a sense of relatedness with the staff around them. So we've got a little bit of indicative evidence here that this pattern is playing itself out, that people are coming with an expectation, it's colouring how they're seeing the relationship with the staff, and that isn't having knock-on effects on their behaviour. Thank you, Josie. Let me just keep one eye on the time and remind myself when I'm supposed to finish. Grand. I might be going through this too quickly, so I'll slow down a bit. So this is looking at the same kind of patterns, but now we're looking at it from the other side, and we're looking at therapists working with patients in forensic settings. This was mostly based in the prison service, or at least most of the therapists were based in the prison service. And we're looking here at, again, three variables. When it says circle, that's a particular measure called the circle, which is a measure of interpersonal behavior from the patient or the prisoner in these cases. And we're looking specifically at withdrawal, which is kind of a hostile, submissive behavior. There's a slightly passive-aggressive approach to other people. So we're looking at that in combination with therapist schemas, in what we call the disconnection domain. So we're looking there at presumptions that other people might not like us, or might reject us, or might in some sense want to dislike us, or want to hurt us. So therapists are also, we might hold some degree of those schemas as well. And then the final measure was a measure of countertransference reactions. And what we have here are three graphs with three different types of countertransference reactions, going from left to right: feelings of helplessness, feelings of hostility towards the patient, and feelings of disengagement from the patient. And you can see in each case there's a lovely cross which indicates there is an interaction between the therapist's schemas and the patient's behaviour. So now we're looking at how, when we are the recipients of the kind of behaviour from the patients, how that can drive reactions from us as mental health professionals. And then if you follow the model around, those reactions in turn start fueling the patient's perception of us again. It's slightly messier than this lovely set of crosses make it look. A little bit more detail I've got written down somewhere, which I will just bring up just so I give you the nitty gritty. So largely these kind of relationships are driven by the, if you like, almost a lack of impact of the patient's behaviour when the therapist had lots of high schemas in this realm. So in that circumstance, the therapist had a tendency to believe that people might not like them or wanted to get rid of them. The withdrawn behaviour on the part of the patient had less of an impact. So possibly indicating that they went in with the expectation the patient would like them, and that was kind of overriding, if you like, the patient's behaviour. But in the circumstance when the therapist didn't tend to have that expectation, the patient's behaviour was capable of driving helplessness, hostility, or disconnection when the patients were more withdrawn, more showing more of that sort of hostile, almost kind of passive aggressive behaviour. So we've got a kind of a subtle kind of complex interactions possible there, which were consistent with that conceptualization of personality disorder. What was interesting to me particularly was the complete lack of any interactions when we're looking at coercive behaviour, which is a hostile, dominating style, which those of us who work closely with patients will have experienced at some point. In that case, that largely was what drove the countertransference reactions, and the therapist schemas didn't really get a look at. And it caused me to think a little bit about this, and it made sense in retrospect. I wish I had hypothesized this, but I didn't. That kind of very intense behavior is quite going to drive a strong response from pretty much anyone, almost regardless of what our own schemas are. You might go into an interaction believing that generally people on your side and like you, but if someone comes up and says that they hate you, it's very hard not to react as if that person hates you. So what I should have expected, I think, in retrospect, with this kind of pattern, some forms of behavior, particularly the kinds of externalizing the behavior that our patients like to throw at us, are so intense that they draw consistent reactions from therapists who might have very different underlying expectations in general of human beings. And that can be a key driver in the maintenance of personality disorder for these kind of patients. You're going to get a very consistent set of feedback from pretty much all staff members who are going to react in ways to try to defend themselves. And that may come out as dislike of the patient, which will leak out on our interpersonal behavior, or withdrawing from the patient, or whatever. Thank you, Josie. So we've got some inconsistent evidence in small studies, underpowered studies, but there's some indications that in Broadmoor, from patient and staff side, there are some of these cycles which are acting out, which could set up recapitulations, reenactments of early experiences in ways that not only would maintain the disorders that patients are with us for treatment of, but set up the kinds of interactions which we are most anxious about as an organization, violence from patients towards staff, or at the other end of that, overly close relationships between patients and staff. But all of this is based on questionnaires. It's all based on getting people to report their experience, almost in retrospect, not capturing live dynamics between patients and staff. We need to do better than that, and that's where we're trying to go next in at least one of the two ways that I've listed, trying to see if we can replicate some of those interpersonal dynamics in things like economic games, those kinds of paradigms. Can we do those on, with patients and staff in the hospital and capture those dynamics live in a measurable way? Or going to the other extreme, I'm exploring with some of my colleagues over at Bournemouth University, the possibility of an ethnographic study. So just observation and being able to try to capture them in a systematic way over a period of time, live, in an unstructured way. Thank you, Josie. So I'll talk a little bit now about what we try to do given the possibility that this is what's happening. What kind of interventions might this suggest that we could try and we could test out? And particularly what we are trying to do at Broadmoor at the moment is something called team formulation, which is a model we're implementing in sessions that get called patient profile sessions at Broadmoor. They get called other things in different sites. So this is not something we've invented out of whole cloth. It's been going on for quite some time as an activity. But we've got a particular approach to it, which is informed by the model I showed you a good few slides ago and the research we've been doing. So team formulation is a facilitated MDT activity. You try to get as many people from as many different perspectives together as you can, which is not really easy in the context of COVID and staff shortages, etc., but we still try. And you try to create a shared understanding of what the service user's experience is by things like sharing important information that people may not be aware of. Many of the members of the multidisciplinary teams just simply don't have a chance to sit down and read lots of reports and understand the kinds of experiences our patients have been through. We create a thinking space, a space where it's safe to say, when this person does this, it hurts, and I want to react with hostility. I don't, but I'm worried that I'm having that reaction. The aim isn't to come up with solutions to problems per se. They may come out, but more in terms of outcomes is about trying to improve those relationships, reducing negative perceptions about the service users, bringing the possibility of interpersonal cycles into people's awareness so that we can try to prevent them from acting themselves out. And to give staff, a sense of reassurance and validation that, of course, you feel like that when you work with this person. That's human. What are we going to do with that so we don't end up reinforcing with the patient believed was the case when they came into this interaction. Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so we've got some very positive feedback about these. We're going to be doing an evaluation that I'll come on to in a little bit, which hopefully I'll be able to feedback at some point. One of the things that stuck with me about these is just a very simple comment from a staff member. We'd only just really started doing the session and just gone through the patient's history. And they said, I didn't know he'd been through that. No wonder he acts like that. And just that moment, you can see that clicking, this person who'd been on the receiving end of some really unpleasant behavior and was really struggling to feel for this patient, just reconnected with their empathy and the reason why they were working with this man in the first place. Thank you, Josie. So this is how we are trying to approach this Broadmoor, building on some of the research that's out there, some of the approaches that are out there already in team formulation and a few other models. And we have a kind of a schematic that we are working on, which we'll aim to publish in due course. So I'll walk you through how we aim for it to work. So we'll start off with the staff, just asking to think about what the main challenges are they're facing with the patient. And then we'll quite deliberately and physically, if we can, put those to one side. So I like to get them written down on a piece of flip chart paper and then put it to one side. Because that's where you're coming in, and you might come back to that. What you want to do is be able to then focus on the individual and your relationships with them. So we'll spend some time talking about the patient's early experiences, particularly focusing on adverse childhood experiences and the impact that may have had on their attachment or their schemas, their kind of unconditional beliefs about the world, how it's shaped the expectations they have of other people. And then we start talking about that interpersonal cycle. How does a patient experience the staff? And particularly there we're focusing on where they might be afraid of them, they feel threatened by them, feel demeaned by them, feel controlled by them. And then how they react to that, their responses, which largely in context are often about trying to either avoid feeling stressed in the first place by cutting off from staff so that the staff can't hurt them, or doing something to reduce their distress. And a particularly effective one is to turn the tables on staff and to put them in the position of being the ones who are being abused or demeaned. That takes back control, it takes back power, it reduces distress, and it makes patients feel safer. If I am the big, bad, scary person here, then I am safe, because you are not safe. Of course, what we're implying there is the staff are put in a position of feeling unsafe or demeaned. They have an experience with the patient which is distressing. And as human beings, they then need to manage their own distress and their own sense of threat. And that's going to be somewhat driven by what they bring in with them. You'll see in the bottom left corner of that schematic what looks like a typo, but is an extended mnemonic, which is just thinking about the different types of experiences that people can bring with them, which shape their experience with other people, including our ethnic background, our religious background, socioeconomic status, and things like that. But also, importantly in that, the narratives that exist in the hospital about the patient. People will have reactions to patients who they've never met because we know the story of that patient. And you can sometimes see that, say, so-and-so is coming to the ward and people will go, ooh. And already they're having a reaction to the patient who's not even there in front of them yet. But going back to the staff reactions, the response to that, to try to manage the distress, might be to distance themselves, become very professional, maybe a little bit more authoritarian, and maybe saying no when actually maybe they could have said yes. It can go the other way. It might be that they end up trying to overcompensate and trying to get this patient to like them by saying yes when really they should have said no. But either way, those reactions can feed back into what the patient expected in the first place. People don't like me. People want to get rid of me. People are just going to take advantage of me. The overcompensation by trying to make the patient like you often goes the same way over time, because eventually it will break down one way or the other, and they will have that experience of rejection yet again. We feed into these things, talk about the patient's strengths and the staff's strengths, and how we can use those to try to manage experiences and responses on both sides. And if it comes out, there may be some ideas about what we could try to do differently. The reason that arrows are in a slightly different colour is I don't necessarily expect that to happen. It isn't necessarily an easy solution. the kinds of challenges the patients are going to throw at us. But we particularly draw attention to how that cycle reenacts and recapitulates and reinforces pre-existing expectations. What we're doing more recently is trying to experiment with to what extent, in the right circumstances, with the proper assessment and clinical discussion, to what extent the patient can be a part of this process, either getting feedback. So I've had some patients who've told me what they want to have fed into the meeting and want to hear back at the end. We have some who we might try to bring in partway through so they can talk about their experience as staff and how they reacted to that and let people see behind the curtain, so to speak. And for some patients who are particularly robust, particularly well regulated, they've been there for the whole discussion. And those have sometimes been particularly powerful in terms of trying to bring people's attention to these kinds of interactions and find ways of making sure people connect and will reconnect with their empathy. Thank you, Josie. So I'll finish off here, and that will give us about 10 minutes either for a coffee break or as many questions as people want to bring. We're doing a service evaluation at the moment, just as a kind of a first step. So we're doing some questionnaires, some in October, we'll do some again in a few weeks. And then we're going to do some interviews with both staff and patients who've experienced these meetings, particularly since we've revamped them to include a greater degree of patient involvement. So what I've got here is not, if you like, feedback from that evaluation, because that hasn't happened yet, but these are comments that have been given to us sometimes quite spontaneously. So in the early days when we were trying this, I asked people deliberately for feedback as well. But it has been pleasing, the types of feedback you get about these kinds of opportunities to think about. People saying they're important, they help us to really know the patients in depth. I'm particularly pleased when people say that it helps them increase or reconnect with their empathy with the patients, help them understand them better, and how it might help them to sort of keep the care patient-centered. So that's all I have lined up on my slides. As I say, what we're going to be doing with this as we go along is also thinking about this as an activity trust-wide. There's different variants of these kinds of things that happen in different parts of the trust. So currently we have what we're thinking of as a broad model, which we're hoping, as I say, to be able to publish at some point. And then we may aim at some point to try to work towards a trust-wide model